I had been a sergeant of the King's Own Guard at the Palace of Harrowgate for 11 years before I ever ran up 4 flights of a spiral staircase after a 9-year-old girl. And I will say for the record that Princess Maelin was faster than I expected, and considerably harder to catch. It started with silence, which is always the first sign that something in a palace has gone wrong. Not a scream, not a crash, just the sudden absence of a small, familiar voice that had been chattering at my elbow one moment and was simply gone the next. I had been posted that autumn to the corridor outside the private apartments in the North Range, an easy post, a quiet one, and Princess Maelin had adopted me the way she adopted most of the guards along her parents' wing, which is to say completely, and without asking permission. She brought me riddles she had invented herself, most of which made no sense and all of which I pretended to find very difficult. She told me the names she had given to the palace cats. She asked me, more than once, whether I had ever fought a dragon, and seemed genuinely disappointed each time I said no. I had come to the King's Own Guard from a small farming district on the far side of Eldermoor, the kind of place that appears on royal maps mostly as a shaded patch of green with a river running through it. And I had joined not out of any grand family tradition of service, but because a recruiting officer had passed through our market town the summer I turned 18, and I had liked, more than I could easily explain at the time, the idea of standing for something larger and steadier than my own small life. 11 years in, I had learned every hallway of Harrowgate the way I had once known every hedgerow of home, and I had come to feel, in a manner I suspect most long-serving guards eventually feel about the families they protect, less like an employee of the crown and more like a distant, permanently on-duty sort of relation, present at every birthday, every scraped knee, every small crisis and celebration of a childhood that was not my own, but that I had nonetheless watched unfold at close range, year upon year, from just inside the doorway. Princess Maelin, in particular, had a gift for making that distance feel smaller than it was. She was the sort of child who noticed things, not just riddles and cat names and the absence of dragons in my personal history, but smaller, quieter things, like the exact week each autumn my knee ached worse in the cold, or the fact that I always stood a half-step closer to the door on the days the household seemed tense, as though bracing for something. She had more than once brought me a biscuit smuggled from the nursery tea tray without being asked, on days she had apparently decided correctly that I needed one. I do not know how a 9-year-old learns to read a grown man's mood so precisely, except to say that Maelin had always struck me as someone paying far closer attention to the world around her than anyone quite gave her credit for, which turned out, as this story will show, to be considerably more true than even I had guessed. That afternoon she had been sitting on the window seat across from my post, swinging her legs and complaining, with the particular outrage only a 9-year-old can summon, that her mother and father were both far too busy to play with her. Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara had a state dinner to prepare for that week. The Kingdom of Eldermoor was hosting envoys from the coastal provinces, and the whole palace had that taut, hurried air it gets before a large occasion, footmen moving faster than usual, someone always carrying flowers, someone always carrying a clipboard. Maelin, aged 9 and full of the particular restlessness of a child who has been told, not now, 4 times in one morning, decided to entertain herself. I noticed she had stopped talking. I looked over. The window seat was empty. I want to be honest about what went through my mind in that first half-second, because it is the same thing that goes through the mind of every guard assigned to a child of that family. Not panic exactly, but a fast, practiced accounting of every door, every stair, every way out of that corridor. I had done this drill in training. I had done it in my head 100 times without ever needing it. The corridor had 3 doors besides the one to the private apartments, a linen closet, a disused stair to the old servants' passage, and at the far end, a heavy oak door with a small brass plaque that read, in letters gone soft with age, Archive West Tower entry by arrangement only. That door was ajar. I crossed the corridor in maybe 6 strides, which is not dignified for a king's own guard sergeant, but was, I felt, entirely called for. The West Tower had been closed to casual use for as long as I'd served at Harrowgate. Not locked exactly, since royal children have an uncanny gift for finding keys and hinges that don't quite catch, but closed, in the sense that nobody went in without the royal archivist present, on account of loose flooring on the upper landing and shelving that hadn't been properly reinforced since before the old king's time. It was, in short, precisely the sort of forbidden, dusty, mysterious place that a bored and clever 9-year-old would find irresistible, and I had a sudden, sinking certainty about exactly where Princess Maelin had gone. I went up the spiral stair 2 steps at a time, calling her name in the particular low, urgent, don't actually panic the child voice we are trained to use, and heard from somewhere above me a small delighted voice call back down, "Corwin, Corwin, come and see." That is my name for what it's worth, though I have gone most of this story without giving it to you. Corwin Ashton, sergeant of the King's Own Guard, 11 years in the palace household by that autumn, 4 of them assigned specifically to the private wing where the royal children live and play and occasionally vanish through unlocked doors. I had known Maelin since she was 5. I had watched her learn to read using the brass letters on the honor board outside the guardroom, sounding out the names of guards who had served the crown 100 years before she was born. I had taught her, against every rule of decorum and possibly several rules of actual protocol, how to whistle through her fingers, a skill her mother has still not entirely forgiven me for. So when I say I was relieved to hear her voice rather than a cry of pain or fright, I was also, in the same breath, bracing myself for whatever trouble she had gotten herself into this time. I found her on the second landing of the West Tower archive, kneeling on a threadbare rug in a shaft of gray afternoon light, in front of an old writing desk that had clearly not been opened in a very long time. The desk was small, dark-wooded, the kind of plain, sturdy furniture that gets shoved into a back room precisely because it isn't grand enough for anywhere else. One of its drawers, a narrow one, tucked beneath the writing surface, the sort you would only notice if you were 9 years old and exactly the right height to be crawling around underneath old furniture, had been pulled all the way out and set on the floor beside her. In her lap she held a flat wooden box, its lid open, and in the box, nestled in a bed of yellowed cloth, sat a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a tarnished locket on a broken chain, and a miniature portrait of a young woman I did not recognize. "Your Highness," I said, in the voice I use when I am trying to sound stern and am not managing it terribly well, "you know this tower is closed." "I know," she said, entirely unbothered, "but Corwin, look, I found a secret. I want to tell you plainly, before this story goes any further, that nothing about what Princess Maelin found that afternoon was dangerous, or dark, or the kind of thing that any child in my care should ever have to be shielded from. I have told other stories in other years about frightened children and locked doors and things a guard has to stand between a young royal and the world to protect them from. This is not that kind of story. Maelin was never once in any danger in that tower. The loose floorboard everyone worried about was 3 landings up, nowhere near where she'd been kneeling, and the worst thing that could realistically have happened to her that afternoon was a sneeze from all the dust. What she had found, tucked into a drawer that had likely not been opened since before her own grandfather was born, was something far gentler and far stranger than danger. She had found a piece of her family that nobody currently living had ever known was there. I crouched down beside her, because there is no dignified way to have this conversation while standing over a 9-year-old sitting on the floor, and because some part of me, I will admit this now, though I would not have admitted it in the moment, was already curious. "Where did this come from?" I asked, nodding at the box. "The drawer wouldn't open all the way," Maelin said, holding up the box like a trophy. "So I had to wiggle it, and then it came all the way out, and there was this little space behind it like a secret cupboard, and the box was just sitting there, Corwin, just sitting there for I don't know how long, and nobody knew, and I found it. There was something in the way she said it, the wonder of it, the sheer delight of a child who has discovered that the world contains hidden things and that she is capable of finding them. That made it very hard to be as stern as my rank required. I looked at the box more closely. The letters were old, the paper gone soft and brown at the folds. The ink faded to a rust brown that told me they were considerably older than anything I would have expected to find in a drawer in the private wing's archive tower, which mostly held ledgers and correspondence from the last 100 years or so. Nothing ancient, nothing grand. I picked up the topmost letter, careful of its brittle edges, and turned it toward the window light. The hand was careful, looping, clearly a young woman's, and the letter began, "My dearest Isbel, I scarcely know how to begin telling you what has happened to me, for I hardly believe it myself, and if I did not still have the mud of the riverbank under my fingernails as I write this, I might convince myself I had dreamed the whole of it." I looked at the signature at the bottom. It read simply, "Your loving sister Aloin." "Who's Aloin?" Maelin asked, watching my face rather than the letter, the way children do when they're trying to work out whether a thing is exciting or worrying from the expression of the nearest adult. I did not know. That was the honest answer, and it troubled me more than I let on, because I had stood duty in that private wing for 4 years, had heard the family history recited at more state functions than I could count, had even, on slow nights, paged through the little illustrated genealogy book kept in the guardroom for exactly the purpose of helping new guards keep the family tree straight. I knew the name of every princess who had ever married into the line going back 200 years. I did not know an Aloin. I looked at the miniature portrait instead, a small oval, painted on ivory, showing a young woman with dark hair and a direct, faintly amused gaze, wearing a plain, high-collared dress that belonged to no fashion I recognized from any of the palace's grand portrait galleries. Not a court gown, not the sort of thing anyone in those galleries had ever been painted wearing. "Corwin," Maelin said, very seriously, tugging at my sleeve, "is it a secret, a real one? And here is where I want to be honest with you about the choice I made, because it is the choice this whole story turns on, and I have thought about it many times since. I could have done what protocol strictly required. I could have taken the box from her hands right there on the landing, told her the tower was off-limits for good reason, sent word to the royal archivist that an unauthorized item had been discovered, and let the whole matter proceed through whatever formal channel exists for old family papers found in old family drawers. That would have been correct. It would also, I think, have been a small cruelty dressed up as procedure, because what Princess Maelin was holding in her lap was not evidence of anything wrong. It was a piece of wonder that she had found with her own 2 hands, in a forgotten drawer, on a rainy afternoon when nobody had time for her, and the very last thing I wanted to do was make her feel, even for a moment, that curiosity was a crime. So instead I said, "It might be, Your Highness, but secrets like this one, the good kind, the old kind, they need to be handled carefully or they get spoiled. Do you understand what I mean?" She nodded, very solemn, the way she always did when I spoke to her, as though she were older than she was, which she liked better than almost anything. "So here is what we are going to do," I said. "We are going to close this box very gently, and we are going to take it somewhere warmer and less dusty, and we are going to try to find out who Aloin was, properly, carefully, the way a real investigation is done. And you are not going to tell anyone yet, not because it's bad, but because a secret that's shared too early loses its shine." "Can you keep that kind of secret?" Princess Maelin's whole face lit up in a way I will remember for the rest of my life, because it was the exact look of a child who has just been told, by an adult she trusts, that her discovery matters, that it is real, that it is hers to be part of rather than something to be taken away and explained to her later by someone else. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I can. I'm very good at secrets. which, I should note, was not entirely true, but I did not say so. I helped her close the box, and I noted, with the part of my mind that never quite stops being a guard, even when the rest of it is charmed by a child's delight, that I would need to think very carefully in the days ahead about how to do this properly. How to satisfy a princess's wonder without breaking the trust the crown placed in me. How to protect an old and harmless family story from becoming a rumor before anyone who deserved to hear it properly had the chance. I did not know yet how complicated that would turn out to be. I only knew, as I carried the box down the spiral stair with Maelin trotting proudly at my side, narrating the discovery to me for the third time as though I had not been there for the first, that whatever Elowin's story was, it was about to become the strangest and warmest assignment of my career. Halfway down the stair, Maelin stopped dead, seized my sleeve, and announced, with the particular gravity of a 9-year-old settling a matter of enormous importance, that a secret this large required a proper secret society, and that a proper secret society required a name. "We can't just call it the Letters," she said, deeply unimpressed with my suggestion of exactly that. "It needs to be something nobody else would understand if they overheard us." "Like a code," I suggested, mostly to see what she would do with it, "that we call our small and entirely unauthorized investigation the Order of the Wobbling Drawer," which she considered with enormous seriousness for the length of an entire landing before declaring it perfect, on the grounds that it was, in her words, so silly nobody would ever suspect it means something real, which struck me, and still strikes me, as rather better strategic thinking than I would have expected from someone who had been sitting on a window seat sulking about her parents an hour earlier. We shook on it solemnly on the landing below the archive, and she insisted the handshake include a particular wiggle of the fingers meant to represent the drawer sticking, and then giving way, which I performed with what I hope was appropriate ceremony, and which she checked, over the days that followed, before allowing either of us to discuss Order of the Wobbling Drawer business, anywhere she judged a servant or a footman might be listening. It became, over that week, a small private language between us. She would catch my eye across a crowded corridor and give the smallest flick of her fingers. Our whole investigation folded into a gesture no passing courtier could have made anything of, and I would find some excuse, 10 minutes later, to walk past wherever she happened to be, so she could whisper the latest theory she'd cooked up about Elowin's life at court. Some of her theories were, I should say honestly, considerably less plausible than others. She spent the better part of one afternoon convinced Elowin must have been secretly a pirate before she was a miller's daughter, purely on the strength of the word riverbank, and required a full accounting from Master Finch, delivered with great patience, of exactly why the geography made that impossible. But the game of it, the shared foolishness of a secret handshake and an invented order and a code name too silly to arouse suspicion, did something I had not expected when I first agreed to it on a dusty landing 5 days before. It turned what could easily have felt, to a 9-year-old, like a solemn and slightly frightening grown-up mystery into something that was, first and always, hers to enjoy. I have come to believe, thinking back on it since, that this was no small part of why the whole affair ended as warmly as it did. A secret handled with a little laughter in it rarely curdles into something a child feels she must hide out of shame. It stays, instead, exactly what it should be, a private joy, shared carefully with someone she trusts. I did not, of course, simply hide a box of unidentified antique documents in my locker and call it discretion. Whatever affection I had for Princess Maelin's excitement, I still wore the uniform of the king's own guard, and there is a difference between protecting a child's joy and being careless with the crown's own history. What I decided, standing on that landing with the box in my hands, was that the honest and proper thing to do was to involve exactly one more person, someone who could tell us, quickly and quietly, whether we were holding a harmless curiosity or something that needed to go through more formal channels before anyone got too attached to it. That person was Aldous Finch. Master Finch had been royal archivist at Harrowgate for nearly 30 years, a small, round, endlessly patient man who smelled permanently of old paper and pipe tobacco. He was not, in fact, allowed to smoke anywhere near his own archive, and who had once spent 40 minutes explaining to me the correct method for turning the page of a 400-year-old ledger without saying a single sentence I could later remember. I liked him enormously. He was the sort of man who treated every question, however small, as though it deserved a full and careful answer, which made him either the best or the worst person to consult when you were in a hurry, depending entirely on how much time you had. I did not have very much time. The state dinner for the coastal envoys was 5 days off. The household was stretched thin, and I knew that if I waited too long to bring this to someone, the delay itself would start to look like concealment, which was the last impression I wanted to give. So the following morning, on my first free hour, I brought the box, wrapped now in a clean cloth, handled the way Master Finch himself had once shown me, down to the main archive room in the palace's east range, with Princess Maelin walking beside me in her riding coat, having informed her governess with great confidence that she was helping Corwin with a very important matter, which was, strictly speaking, true. Master Finch took one look at the box, one look at the letters, and went very quiet in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Well," he said at last, turning the topmost letter over in his hands with the particular reverence he reserved for anything genuinely old. "Well, well, well." "Is it bad?" Maelin asked immediately, climbing half onto the reading table to see better, which earned her a mild look from Master Finch that she entirely ignored. "Bad," Finch repeated, as though the word tasted strange in his mouth. "No, Your Highness, I shouldn't think so. Unusual, certainly. Unexpected, very much so, but bad, no. Let me look properly before either of us decides anything." Before he turned to the genealogy volumes, Master Finch opened the little tarnished locket itself, working its stiff clasp with the careful patience of a man who had coaxed open a great many stubborn old hinges in his career. And inside, pressed flat against the glass, we found not a portrait at all but a single dried sprig of some small white river flower, so old it had gone the color of weak tea, and a curl of dark hair tied with a thread too fine to have survived so long except by pure improbable luck. Maelin went very quiet at the sight of it, in a different way than her earlier excitement. A hushed, careful quiet, the kind a child reserves for things she senses, correctly, are more fragile than they look. "Do you think that's her hair?" she whispered. "Or his?" "I couldn't say for certain," Master Finch admitted, turning the locket gently toward the light, "though I would guess hers, kept perhaps by him, or given by her as a keepsake before some parting neither of them wanted. People did that in those days when they had no likeness to carry and no certainty of when they'd next see each other." He closed the locket again with the same care he'd opened it, and set it down beside the letters as though it might otherwise startle. "Whatever the truth of it, Your Highness, I think we can say with some confidence that whoever carried this locket carried it because it mattered to them enormously. Nobody keeps a wilted flower pressed in silver for 200 years by accident." He spent the better part of an hour with the letters, the locket, and the little portrait, consulting, at intervals, a set of enormous leather-bound genealogy volumes that lived on a shelf behind his desk, and that I had always assumed contained every possible fact about the royal line that could ever need consulting. He found, eventually, the entry he was looking for, a page dense with old-fashioned handwriting, dates, a small painted crest, and turned it around so Maelin and I could see it. "Here," he said, tapping a name near the middle of the page. "5 generations back from you, Your Highness. Crown Prince Osric of Eldermoor, who reigned for 11 years in his father's stead before his own coronation. And here, his consort." The name beside Prince Osric's read, in the same careful old hand as the rest of the volume, Princess Cordelia, of noble family, married in the 11th year of the old king's reign. "That's not her," Maelin said at once, with the flat certainty of a child who has already decided something is a mystery and is not going to be talked out of it. The letters are signed Elowen. "Look, Master Finch, look at the picture. It's the same lady, I know it is, the same nose and everything." Finch held the miniature portrait up beside the little painted crest in the genealogy book, comparing the two faces, and I watched something shift in his own expression. Not alarm, exactly, but the very particular excitement of a man who has spent 30 years cataloging the expected and has just been handed something he did not expect at all. "You may be right, Your Highness," he said slowly. "You may very well be right. This book was compiled some 60 years after the fact, from official court records, and official court records, I am sorry to tell you, are not always written by people who care very much for the truth of a thing, so much as the tidiness of it. If your Princess Cordelia and this letter writer's Elowen are one and the same woman, then somewhere between her own lifetime and the writing of this book, somebody smoothed her story into something rather more presentable than whatever actually happened." "Smoothed how?" I asked. "That," said Master Finch, setting the book down with the air of a man accepting a challenge he had not expected to receive that week, "is precisely what we are going to have to find out. Our very first theory, I should admit honestly, was entirely wrong, and cost us the better part of that first day before Master Finch caught the error. There was another name in the genealogy book, 2 branches over from Prince Osric's own line, belonging to a lady-in-waiting recorded simply as E. Thorne, companion to the household, and for the better part of an afternoon we were all 3 of us convinced this must be our Elowen, misfiled and mislabeled rather than deliberately obscured. Maelin was especially taken with the theory, having decided that E. Thorne sounded appropriately mysterious, and spent a happy hour drafting an entire imagined biography for her before Master Finch, cross-referencing a set of household wage ledgers nobody had thought to consult first, discovered that E. Thorne had in fact been a considerably older woman, a widow of minor gentry who had served 3 decades in the household and died, by all accounts comfortably, and without any river-related drama whatsoever, at the age of 81. "Well," Maelin said, when Finch broke this news to her with visible reluctance, clearly bracing for disappointment, "at least now we know it's not her. That's still finding something out, isn't it, even if it's finding out what's wrong?" I thought that was, honestly, rather a wise way to look at an afternoon's wasted effort, and told her so, and she looked so pleased with the compliment that she repeated the sentiment to Master Finch twice more before the day was through, as though it might wear better with practice. It was, in its own small way, the first proper lesson of the order of the wobbling drawer, that an investigation is rarely a straight line from question to answer, and that most of the walking involved happens sideways or backward before it happens forward again. Master Finch, entirely unbothered by the false start, simply widened his search the following morning, which was how he came to the parish records and the flood chronicle that finally, properly, pointed us toward the truth. What followed were 4 of the strangest, and, I will say plainly, happiest days of my career at Harrowgate, though I did not think of them that way at the time. At the time, I mostly thought of them as an increasingly delicate juggling act between my ordinary duties and an investigation that technically had no official standing whatsoever. I could not simply abandon my post to go chasing 200-year-old rumors through dusty record rooms. So what actually happened was that Princess Maelin and I conducted our inquiry in scraps. A half-hour here before her lessons, 20 minutes there while I was meant to be walking the perimeter of the private gardens. One entire glorious wet afternoon, when the coastal envoy's arrival was delayed by weather and half the household's urgent business simply evaporated for a day. Master Finch, for his part, did the bulk of the real work, and did it with the quiet, focused delight of a man who had waited 30 years for exactly this kind of puzzle. He pulled parish records from a coastal district 2 days' ride from Harrowgate, records that had been transferred to the Crown Archive decades earlier as part of some long-forgotten administrative tidying and had sat, as far as I could tell, entirely unread since. He found reference, in an old chronicle of the region, to a flood that had struck the district in the spring of the year the genealogy book listed as Princess Cordelia's marriage, a flood bad enough that the chronicle described it in some detail, including, almost in passing, a mention of the young crown prince, saved from the river by a miller's daughter of uncommon courage, whose name the writer regrets he did not think to record. There, Maelin said, when Finch read that line aloud to us, thumping the table with a satisfaction that made a stack of loose papers jump. There, that's her. That's Elowen. I was inclined to agree, though I made a show, for the sake of my own dignity as an investigator, of pointing out that the chronicle did not actually name her, and that we would need better proof than a hunch and a coincidence of timing before anyone could say for certain. Master Finch, bless him, took this as encouragement rather than caution, and threw himself into finding that proof with a determination I had not previously suspected he possessed. The second of those 4 days I remember almost hour by hour, because it was the day Maelin insisted we go and stand in front of the actual painted portrait of Princess Cordelia, the grand formal one that hung, as it had hung for as long as anyone could remember, in the long gallery among 24 other royal ancestors in gilt frames taller than I am. I had walked past that gallery more times than I could count without ever once really looking at any of the faces in it. A guard on a fixed route learns to see a corridor as a shape to be walked, not a room full of people to be studied. And I found, standing in front of Cordelia's portrait with Maelin's small hand tucked into mine, and the miniature portrait wrapped carefully in cloth in my other pocket, that I had genuinely never noticed how strange that particular painting was. It was a fine piece of work, technically. Whoever the court painter had been, he had clearly been skilled, had rendered the silk of the gown and the pearls at the throat, and the cool, composed set of the mouth with real craft. But the face itself had a peculiar flatness to it that I could not at first put into words, and it was Maelin, of all people, who found the word for it before I did. She looks like nobody, Maelin said, tipping her head to one side, studying the painting with the frank, unimpressed scrutiny children bring to things adults have been trained to admire without question. I mean, she looks like a painting of a princess, not like a real lady, not like the letters. She was right, and once she'd said it I could not stop seeing it. The eyes in the grand portrait were the correct shape and the correct color, according to whatever description had survived, but there was nothing behind them, no particular tilt of amusement, no hint of the woman who had scolded a future king for being a fool by a riverbank. I compared it, as best I could without drawing the attention of the 2 footmen dusting the gallery's far end, to the small ivory miniature in my pocket, and the difference was unmistakable even to my untrained eye. The miniature had almost certainly been painted from life, by someone who had actually sat across from Elowen and watched her face do something while she watched it back. The grand portrait, I would learn later from Master Finch, had been commissioned nearly 40 years after her death, by a great-grandson eager to have a properly imposing ancestral gallery, working from nothing but a written description and, apparently, his own considerable imagination. They painted a princess, I said slowly, working it out as I spoke, because that's what they thought a princess ought to look like, not because that's what she actually looked like. That's sad, Maelin said, and then, brightening immediately in the way only a 9-year-old can manage, but we're going to fix it, aren't we, Corwin? We're going to find out what she really looked like and really was, and then everyone who walks past this picture is going to know the truth, even if the picture itself doesn't change. I told her I thought that sounded exactly right, and I meant it, though I did not yet know how we were going to manage it, or how much trouble the finding out was about to cause. It was that same afternoon, wandering back from the gallery by way of the old nursery wing rather than the direct route, that we stumbled on the second small piece of the puzzle, in a place neither Master Finch nor I would ever have thought to look. Maelin's old nurse, a warm, round woman named Mistress Hollies, who had minded 3 generations of Harrowgate children, and was, by that point, mostly retired to a sunny sitting room where she did needlework and kept half an eye on whichever small royal happened to wander past, was humming a tune I half recognized when we passed her door. A simple, lilting nursery rhyme I myself had heard sung to Maelin's younger brother more than once without ever really listening to the words. "What's that song, Mistress Hollies?" Maelin asked, poking her head in, because Maelin poked her head into every open door within reach as a matter of principle. "Oh, that old thing," Mistress Hollies said, not looking up from her needlework. "The Miller's Daughter. Every nurse in this palace has sung it since before I was one myself. Nobody knows where it came from, only that it's always been sung to the little ones at bedtime." And then, in a soft, unhurried voice, entirely unaware of the effect her words were about to have, she sang the first verse through for us. A simple little tune about a girl who pulled a stranger from a river, and never once dreamed a crown, and got one anyway because her heart was already good before anybody put a title on it. I do not think I have ever seen a child go as still as Maelin went in that doorway. "That's her," she whispered, once Mistress Hollies had finished and gone back to her needlework, entirely unaware she had just handed us the missing piece of a 200-year-old mystery. "Corwin, that's a Lowen. It's a song. It's been a song this whole time, and nobody knew it was true. They just thought it was a nice old rhyme for putting babies to sleep." It was, Master Finch confirmed later that evening, turning the matter over with the delight of a man discovering that the ground beneath his own archive was even richer than he'd realized. Entirely plausible, more than plausible, likely, that the rhyme had begun as something closer to memory than invention, sung first by servants who had known a Lowen in life, and passed down, generation after generation of nursery staff, long after the court itself had smoothed her out of its official record. The family had, in a manner of speaking, never actually forgotten her at all. They had simply stopped knowing that they remembered her. "That is the trouble with old palaces," Master Finch said, closing his eyes for a moment as though listening to something only he could hear. "The truth so rarely disappears entirely. It just gets tucked into a corner, a nursery rhyme, a wobbling drawer, a nurse who never thought to ask why the tune felt so old, and it waits, quite patiently, for someone curious enough to go looking." The proof Finch needed came 3 days later, in the bundle of letters itself. Because we had, in our first excitement, only read the top letter, the one that began "My dearest Ispel," and had left the rest of the bundle carefully retied, waiting for a calmer moment to go through properly. When Finch finally untied the ribbon and laid all 7 letters out in order by their dates, a story emerged that none of us had expected, though I think, looking back, some part of me had already guessed the shape of it from that very first line about mud on the riverbank. The letters were written across the span of about a year and a half, all addressed to the same sister, Ispel, back in a village called Brackenford, and they told, in a voice so vivid and so plainly, unmistakably honest that reading them felt less like historical research and more like eavesdropping on a friend, the story of a miller's daughter named Lowen who had pulled a half-drowned stranger from a flooded river one spring morning, not knowing, because how could she have known, that the shivering, mud-covered young man she'd hauled onto the bank by his collar and shouted at for being a fool to go near the water in that state was the Crown Prince of Eldermoor, traveling in plain clothes and entirely unrecognized, on his way to inspect the coastal defenses. The first letter told the story of that morning with a kind of breathless, disbelieving humor that made Master Finch laugh out loud twice while reading it aloud, and made Princess Maelin demand he read the funniest parts a second time. Lowen described dragging the prince up the bank by his collar, as he sputtered and protested that he was perfectly capable of standing on his own. "Thank you," and her own reply, which she recorded proudly for her sister's benefit, was that he had not looked capable of standing on his own 2 minutes before, and she would thank him to stop arguing with the person who had just saved his fool life. It was only afterward, when a search party in the Crown's colors came thundering down the road calling out titles she did not recognize as belonging to the mud-streaked young man wrapped in her own shawl, that she understood who she had just hauled out of a river by his collar and scolded like a wayward younger brother. "He must have been so embarrassed," Maelin said, delighted. "I imagine he was," Finch agreed, though it seems from the second letter that embarrassment did not stop him coming back. It had not. The second letter, written some 6 weeks later, described a formal visit from the Crown Prince to the mill where Elowen's family lived and worked, ostensibly to thank her family properly, and see that they were fairly compensated for their trouble. A visit that, Elowen wrote to her sister with evident and slightly scandalized amusement, had lasted considerably longer than any reasonable expression of gratitude required, and had ended with the Crown Prince asking Elowen, in front of her entire flustered family, whether she might consider teaching him to fish properly, since he had clearly made rather a mess of it the first time. The letters after that traced, in Elowen's own unpolished, funny, occasionally worried voice, the slow and clearly unplanned unfolding of something neither of them had gone looking for. She wrote about her fear that she would be laughed out of any room she was ever brought into at court, a miller's daughter among people who had never in their lives had to think about the price of flour. She wrote, in one letter that made even Master Finch go quiet for a moment, about a night she cried in the mill loft because she did not believe a prince could really mean to marry a girl like her, and was certain the whole business would end in humiliation for her family. And she wrote, in the final letter of the bundle, dated barely a fortnight before what the genealogy book recorded as the date of Prince Osric's marriage to Princess Cordelia, of noble family, about the small quiet ceremony that had actually taken place, and about her own decision, hers, not anyone else's, she was careful to make clear, to let the court call her whatever tidy, respectable name it needed to call her. So long as her family back in Brackenford never wanted for anything again, and so long as Osric himself never once, not even once, forgot where she had actually come from. I still think, still to this day, of one particular line from that last letter, because Master Finch read it aloud in the quiet archive room with Princess Maelin leaning against my arm, and none of us said anything for a good while afterward. Elowen had written, "Let them paint me however grand they like in whatever portraits they hang. I will always know, and he will always know, that the first thing I ever said to a crown prince of Eldermoor was that he was a fool for going near that water, and I have never in my life been prouder of a single sentence." "So she wasn't a real princess," Maelin said eventually, turning it over slowly, in the careful way she worked through anything that mattered to her. "She was just a miller's daughter who saved someone, and then everyone pretended she'd always been a princess." "She was entirely a real princess, Your Highness," Master Finch said gently. "That is rather the point of the whole story. She simply was not born one, and somebody, 60 years after the fact, decided that detail was too untidy for a genealogy book, and wrote her a more comfortable history instead." I watched Maelin sit with that for a long moment, her small face working through something that looked, to my eye, like the particular pride of a child discovering that the ground she stands on is more interesting than she had been told. "That's not fair to her," she said finally. "She was brave. She pulled a whole prince out of a river. That's better than being born a princess. That's better than anybody in the boring old book." "I quite agree," said Master Finch, "and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did too. It would be pleasant to tell you that this was the end of the story, that we simply carried our discovery, delighted and complete, straight to Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara, and that the whole business unfolded from there in an easy, uncomplicated line toward the warm ending it deserved. It did not happen that way, and I think it is worth telling you honestly how it actually did happen, because the part that came next taught me more about the particular kind of duty a king's own guard owes to a child than almost anything else in my career. The trouble began, as trouble in a large household so often does, with a conversation I was not part of and would not learn the details of until it was already causing difficulty. Master Finch, in his enthusiasm, an enthusiasm I do not fault him for, because I shared every bit of it, had mentioned to one of the palace's portrait conservators, a perfectly well-meaning woman named Mistress Cade, who had been engaged that season to clean and reframe several of the older family portraits ahead of the state dinner, that he had come across some interesting evidence suggesting a discrepancy in the recorded history of one of the family's older marriages. He had meant it, I am certain, as nothing more than a piece of archivist's shop talk between two people who both cared about old paper and old paint. Mistress Cade, however, mentioned it, in the entirely ordinary course of her own work, to the palace controller, a meticulous and permanently harried man named Selwyn Rennick, whose entire professional life was organized around the principle that nothing about the royal household should ever be discovered rather than properly disclosed. I want to be fair to Master Rennick, because it would be easy, telling this story quickly, to make him sound like an obstacle rather than a person, and he was never that. He was, in his own way, doing exactly what his position required of him. His task was to see that nothing embarrassing, nothing unverified, and above all nothing that might reach the ears of a foreign envoy in the middle of a delicate diplomatic week, could possibly slip out of Harrowgate uncontrolled. When Mistress Cade told him, with entirely innocent intentions, that the royal archivist believed there was some discrepancy in the succession records, Master Rennick heard, not a sweet story about a brave miller's daughter, but the single most alarming phrase a man in his position could hear 5 days before a state dinner. A question mark over the family's own official history, discovered by a child, in a locked tower, during the 1 week of the year when every eye in the kingdom was already turned toward Harrowgate. He came to find me on the 5th day, in the corridor outside the private apartments, with the particular clipped, controlled urgency of a man who has been rehearsing what he is about to say for the length of an entire staircase. "Sergeant Ashdown," he said, "I am told Princess Maelin discovered certain documents in the West Tower archive. I am told you were aware of this and did not report it through the proper channel. I am told the royal archivist is now referring, in front of the household staff, to a discrepancy in the succession records of this family. I would like you to explain to me, calmly, exactly what is going on, and I would like the documents in question placed under my authority within the hour." There it was, the moment, 5 days into what had felt, to Maelin and to me, like a shared adventure, when the whole warm, private, delighted little investigation we had built together suddenly threatened to become something cold, official, and taken entirely out of our hands. "Master Rennick," I said, keeping my voice level, "nothing about this is a threat to anyone. It's a bundle of old letters from a marriage 200 years past, and a rather lovely story, if you'll let me tell it to you properly." "I am sure it is lovely, Sergeant," he said, in the particular tight voice of a man who has too much on his plate to be told to slow down and enjoy a story. "I am also aware that we have envoys from 3 coastal provinces arriving in this palace within the week, that the household is already stretched to its limit, and that the last thing this family needs, 5 days before that dinner, is a member of staff repeating the phrase, discrepancy in the succession records, where anyone with an idle tongue might overhear it. Do you understand how that phrase sounds, Sergeant, coming from anyone but the family itself?" I did understand, actually, and that was the trouble. I understood his fear completely, even as I was certain it was misplaced. A palace runs on the careful management of exactly this kind of thing, not because anyone is hiding wrongdoing, but because rumor moves faster than truth, and a household that has learned to fear the sound of its own history being questioned learns to lock every door before asking what's actually behind it. Rennick was not being unkind. He was being exactly as careful as his position demanded, and if I had been in his chair, 5 days from a state dinner, hearing secondhand that a princess's succession was somehow in question, I might have reacted no differently. But I thought of Maelin on that dusty landing, holding the box up like a trophy, telling me she'd found a secret, and I thought of the particular vulnerable trust she'd placed in me when she asked whether she could keep it, and I knew that whatever happened next, I was not going to let this become a story about a child being scolded for her own curiosity, or a piece of family history being quietly buried under procedure, because it was inconvenient during a busy week. "Give me until this evening," I said. "Let me bring you the full picture myself, together with Master Finch, before anything is locked away or reported further up the chain. If after that you still believe this needs to go through a formal review, I will not stand in your way. But I am asking you, as one servant of this household to another, not to let this become bigger and colder than it needs to be before anyone has actually heard what it is." "I have already spoken to the Lord Chamberlain's office this morning, Sergeant," Rennick said, and I felt my stomach drop at that, because it meant the matter had already traveled further than I'd realized while I'd been standing in an archive room marveling over old letters. In general terms only, I named no names, described no documents, but I told them a matter concerning the family's historical records had come to my attention and might require formal review before the state dinner. If I do nothing further today, that inquiry sits quietly and likely goes nowhere. If word reaches them that I knew more and sat on it, the inquiry becomes considerably less quiet and considerably less within my control or yours. Then let me make sure there's nothing left for anyone to sit on," I said. "Not by hiding it, Master Rennick, by finishing it properly tonight in the one way that actually closes the matter for good. A family that already knows its own history isn't a family with a discrepancy in its succession records. It's just a family with a fuller story than the one that used to be written down. There's no inquiry to be had once the people who actually matter already know the truth and have decided themselves what to do with it." He was quiet long enough that I could hear, faintly, the sound of footmen moving in the corridor beyond his office door, the ordinary business of the household continuing on entirely unaware of how much hinged, in that small room, on one careful man deciding whether to trust a sergeant he had never had particular cause to doubt. "You understand," he said finally, "that if this goes wrong, if word gets out before the family has had its say, if some version of this reaches a coastal envoy's ear over dinner as gossip rather than as the family's own settled account, the consequence lands on my desk, not yours. I am the one who will have to explain to the Lord Chamberlain why a sergeant of the private wing detail was permitted to manage a matter of the succession record on his own initiative. I understand that, sir. I'm asking you to trust me with it anyway for one evening." Master Rennick considered me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his own instinct for caution against the fact that I had never, in 4 years under his notice, given him cause to think I was careless with the family's trust. "This evening," he said finally. "And Sergeant, the documents stay in Master Finch's keeping in the meantime, not yours and certainly not the princess's." That last part, I confess, stung more than it should have, though I understood the sense of it. I found Princess Maelin 20 minutes later in the small sitting room off the nursery, and I had to tell her that the box, her box, the one she had found with her own hands, was, for the moment, out of both our hands entirely, sitting under lock in Master Finch's office while grown-ups decided what to do about it. I have delivered a great many pieces of difficult news to a great many people in my career, and I do not think any of them landed on me quite as heavily as watching Maelin's face fall when I told her that. "But it's mine," she said, and her voice had none of its usual bright certainty in it, just a small, wounded confusion. "I found it. Nobody else found it. Am I in trouble? Is Eloin going to just get locked away again, like nobody found her at all? You are not in trouble, I said, and meant it with everything in me. Not for a moment, not for one single moment, do you hear me? You found something wonderful, and finding wonderful things is never, ever something to be sorry for. What's happening right now isn't a punishment. It's just grown-ups being careful in a week when everyone in this palace is already tired and worried about other things. It has nothing to do with whether your secret was good. It was very good. It still is. Then why does it feel like it's being taken away? I did not have a clean answer for that, because she was not wrong. It did feel that way, and pretending otherwise would have insulted her intelligence in a way I was not willing to do. What I told her instead, and I chose these words carefully, because I meant to keep the promise inside them, was this. Because sometimes the right way to protect something good takes longer and looks less exciting than the way we'd like it to happen. I am not going to let Eloin's story get locked in a drawer and forgotten twice, Your Highness. I promise you that. But I need you to trust me for one more evening, the way you trusted me on that landing 5 days ago. Can you do that? She looked at me for a long moment with the unnervingly direct gaze children sometimes turn on adults when they are deciding whether a promise is real, and then she nodded once and did not cry, though I could see it cost her something not to. I did not go straight to Crown Prince Rowan's study, whatever the rest of this story might suggest. I want to be honest about that too, because it would be easy, telling it now, to make myself sound more certain of the right course than I actually was in that moment. What I did first, before I trusted my own judgment with something this delicate, was seek out the one person at Harrowgate whose opinion I valued above almost anyone else's in matters of exactly this kind. Captain Isolt Varen, who had commanded the King's Own Guard's private wing detail for the better part of 20 years before her retirement the previous spring, and who still lived in a modest cottage just beyond the palace's eastern wall. Close enough that half the household still found excuses to walk that way when they needed her counsel. She was in her garden when I arrived, unannounced and still faintly out of breath from the walk, kneeling among a row of late-season vegetables with dirt to her elbows, and she took one look at my face before I'd said a single word, and told me to sit down on the low stone wall and start from the beginning. I told her everything, the empty window seat, the drawer, the letters, Master Finch's careful unraveling of the mystery, Rennick's very reasonable fear, the promise I had made to a 9-year-old girl not to let her discovery be locked away and forgotten twice. Captain Varen listened without interrupting me once, which was, I had learned across the 4 years I'd served under her before her retirement, exactly what she did when a problem actually mattered to her. "You're worried you've overstepped," she said when I'd finished, not as a question. "I know I've overstepped, Captain. I went around Rennick's authority without asking. I involved the princess in something that hadn't gone through any proper channel. If I take this to Crown Prince Rowan directly and I've read the whole situation wrong, I don't know what it costs me, and I don't much care, honestly, except that I'd hate for it to cost her something too." Captain Varen sat back on her heels and considered me for a long moment, the way she used to consider a new recruit before deciding whether he had the makings of a guard worth training properly. "Let me ask you something, Corwin, and I want you to answer it honestly, not the way you think I want to hear it. In 11 years, have you ever once used your position in that private wing to protect yourself, rather than the family you're sworn to?" "No, Captain." "And is that what you're doing now, protecting yourself?" "No," I said, and found, saying it aloud, that it was entirely true. "I'm protecting a 9-year-old's trust in the idea that finding something wonderful is safe to do. I think if I let this go through Rennick's process untouched, she'll learn a lesson I don't want her to learn, that curiosity gets confiscated, that wonder gets filed away by people who are too busy to feel it the way she felt it. I don't think that's the lesson the Crown wants its children learning either, whatever Rennick's own worries are about the timing of it." "Then you already know what you're going to do," Captain Varen said, climbing to her feet and brushing the dirt from her knees with the brisk, no-nonsense economy of movement I remembered from every drill she'd ever run. "You didn't come here to ask my permission, Corwin. You came here because you wanted someone who's worn that uniform longer than you have to tell you that the instinct you're already following is a sound one. So I'll tell you plainly, it is. A guard's first duty is to the family's safety. Yes. But its second duty, and I'd argue very nearly its equal, is to the family's dignity, and there is precious little dignity in a child learning that the honest thing to do with a discovery is hide it, or that the safe thing to do with wonder is smother it before anyone official gets nervous. Go and see Crown Prince Rowan. Tell him exactly what you told me, in exactly that order, and if he throws you out of his study for your trouble, you come back here and I'll pour you something considerably stronger than the tea I was about to offer you." I did not, in the end, need the stronger drink, though I have thought of her offer fondly more than once since, and I have made a point, in the months that followed, of walking the long way past her cottage more often than strictly necessary, the way half the household seems to. I spent the rest of that afternoon doing something I had never once done in 11 years of service. I went, off duty and entirely on my own initiative, to request an audience, not with the controller and not with the royal archivist, but with Crown Prince Rowan himself. I want to explain why I did not simply let the matter proceed through the controller's formal review, because on the surface it might sound as though I was overstepping, and in a sense I was. But I had thought it through carefully during that long afternoon, turning the problem over the way Master Finch turned over an old page, looking for the seam in it. The trouble, as I understood it, was never really about whether Eloan's story was true, or whether it was safe to reveal. Master Finch's evidence had settled that question days ago, and settled it warmly. The trouble was about who got to be the one to tell it, and how, whether it would reach Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara filtered through a controller's cautious memorandum, reduced to the phrase, a discrepancy in the succession records, stripped of every ounce of the wonder and tenderness that had made Maelin's whole face light up on that dusty landing, or whether it would reach them the way it deserved to, as a gift from their daughter freely given. Crown Prince Rowan received me that evening in his private study, still in his shirt sleeves, a stack of dinner seating arrangements spread across his desk, looking every bit like a man who did not have a single spare minute that week and knew it. I had met him many times in the ordinary course of duty, had opened doors for him, walked corridors beside him, but I had never once, in 4 years, requested to speak with him about anything beyond the routine business of a guard's post, and I could see the faint surprise in his face when I asked whether I might have 10 minutes of his time on a private matter concerning his daughter. "Is Maelin all right?" he asked at once, straightening, every trace of the seating chart forgotten. "She's perfectly well, sir," I said quickly. "Better than well. I need to tell you a rather long story, and I would ask you to hear the whole of it before you decide what to make of it." To his very great credit, he did. I told him everything, start to finish, in the order it had actually happened: the empty window seat, the ajar door, the wobbling drawer, the box, the letters, Master Finch's careful unraveling of parish records and old chronicles, the flood, the miller's daughter, the mud on the riverbank, the line about being prouder of one sentence than of any portrait ever painted of her. I told him about Master Rennick's very reasonable fear, and about the promise I had made to a 9-year-old girl an hour before, sitting in a small sitting room off the nursery, that her secret would not simply be locked in a drawer and forgotten twice. Crown Prince Rowan did not say a word until I had finished. When I did, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for long enough that I began to worry I had badly misjudged the whole undertaking, that I had overstepped a line no sergeant of the guard had any business overstepping, and that whatever came next would undo far more than it repaired. Then he said very softly, "Osric of Eldermoor, my own great-great-great-grandfather, Do you know, I have stood beside that man's portrait at 100 state functions and never once wondered a single thing about the woman beside him. She's just Cordelia, a name in a book. I couldn't have told you a single fact about her if you'd asked me this morning. She was rather more than a name, sir, I said. I believe your daughter would tell you the same, at considerably greater length, if you gave her the chance. He looked up at me then, and there was something in his face, not anger, not even really surprise anymore, but a kind of quiet, dawning warmth, the look of a man realizing that his own family's story was larger and stranger and better than he had ever been told. She kept this from me for 5 days, he said, and instead of telling her mother and me straight away, you helped her keep it a little longer. I did, sir. I want to be honest with you about why. She found this with her own hands, in a place she wasn't meant to be, on an afternoon when she was lonely and bored and nobody had time for her. I did not want the very first thing that happened to her wonderful discovery to be an adult taking it away from her and handling it without her. I still believe, that the right ending to this story is one where Maelin herself gets to hand you this piece of your family's history, rather than one where it reaches you through Master Rennick's careful memorandum with all the joy scrubbed out of it. If I was wrong to make that choice without asking your permission first, sir, I will answer for it. But I'd ask you to let her be the one to tell you tonight, before anything else happens to this story. Crown Prince Rowan looked at me for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed, not unkindly, but with something like relief in it, the laugh of a busy, tired man who has just been handed, in the middle of a wearying week, something unexpectedly good. Sergeant Ashdown, he said, I believe you have just talked your way into becoming this family's second favorite conspirator after my daughter herself. Bring her to me this evening. And bring Master Finch too, and whatever remains of that box. I want to see all of it, and I want my wife to hear it exactly the way you've just told it to me. I do not think I have ever felt lighter walking down a palace corridor than I did leaving that study, though I want to be honest and tell you that the relief did not last uninterrupted, because I still had to face Master Rennick with the news that the matter was, as of that evening, no longer his to manage through the ordinary channel, and a controller who has spent an entire afternoon bracing for a crisis does not always take kindly to being told, an hour before the evening he had set aside for it, that the crisis has quietly rearranged itself around him. To his credit, when I found him and explained, plainly and without any pretense that I had followed procedure as neatly as he might have liked, Master Rennick did not shout, and did not dig in his heels the way I half expected. He listened, his jaw working slightly, and when I had finished he said only, Crown Prince Rowan approves of this arrangement personally. He does, sir. He asked for it himself not 20 minutes ago. Rennick exhaled slowly, and something in his shoulders eased, the particular unclenching of a careful man who has just been given permission to stop being careful for one evening. Then I suppose, he said, my objection is withdrawn. I will say, Sergeant, that I still think you took a considerable risk going around me the way you did. I will also say, and I would ask you not to make a habit of quoting me on this, that I am rather glad you did. I stopped by the archive on my way back through the palace to tell Master Finch what had been decided, and found him considerably more anxious than I expected, pacing, in fact, a small tight circuit between his desk and the window, in a way I had never once seen the unflappable old archivist do in all the years I'd known him. I heard the controller's office had involved itself, he said, the moment I stepped through the door, before I had even managed a greeting. I confess I have been sitting here for the better part of an hour composing, in my head, an entire defense of scholarly inquiry, in the event I was summoned to answer for encouraging a princess into an unauthorized investigation. You won't need it, I told him, and watched real relief move across his round, careful face as I explained what Crown Prince Rowan had asked for that evening. Though I'd be glad of your defense of scholarly inquiry another time, purely for my own education, I imagine it was thorough. It was extremely thorough, Master Finch admitted, allowing himself at last to sit back down. I had prepared no fewer than 3 separate historical precedents for the legitimate reclassification of misfiled succession records, and I will confess, rather disappointed I shan't get to deliver any of them. He gathered the box carefully, tucking the letters back into their bed of yellowed cloth with the same reverent care he'd shown them from the very first afternoon. I am glad it has ended this way, Sergeant, and not the other. I have spent 30 years in this archive, believing that the truest purpose of this whole enormous, dusty collection is not to guard the family's history against the family itself, but to keep it safe until the right person comes looking for it. I would have found it a very poor use of 30 years' work to watch that principle fail on the one occasion it mattered most. I told him I thought that was as fine a description of a guard's own duty as I had heard in 11 years of service, and he seemed pleased enough by the comparison that he insisted, before I left, on wrapping the box one final time in a fresh length of protective cloth himself, muttering all the while about proper handling, as though the last 5 days had not already proven, several times over, that he trusted no one else in the palace with the task quite so completely as he trusted himself. I found Princess Maelin exactly where I had left her, curled into the corner of the nursery sitting room with a book she was plainly not reading, her chin propped on her fist in the particular posture of a child bracing herself against disappointment. When I told her that her father wanted to see her, that very evening, and that she was going to be the one to tell him about Aloin herself, with the box in her own hands, I watched 5 days of worry drain out of her all at once, replaced by something so bright and so immediate that she actually knocked her book clean off the window seat leaping up. "I get to tell him," she said. "Me, not Master Finch, not you, me." "You found her," I said. "It's only right that you're the one to bring her home." We collected Master Finch from the archive, and the box from beneath his careful custody, and the 3 of us made our way together through the evening corridors of Harrowgate toward the Crown Prince's private study, Maelin walking between us with the box held against her chest as though it might float away if she loosened her grip for even a moment. I will admit that I felt, walking that familiar corridor, a nervousness that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with simply wanting, very badly, for this evening to go the way I had promised her it would. Princess Alara was already in the study when we arrived, seated beside her husband, and I could see at once from her face that Rowan had told her only the barest outline, enough to bring her, curious and a little wary, but not enough to spoil whatever was coming. She looked at the box in her daughter's arms, and then at Maelin's face, which was doing absolutely nothing to hide the fact that she was holding the single most exciting thing that had ever happened to her. "Well," Alara said, smiling despite herself, "you had better sit down and tell us everything, hadn't you?" Maelin set the box down on the low table between the 2 chairs with a care I had not seen her manage all week, as though she understood, without needing to be told, that this particular unveiling deserved a steadier hand than the excited scramble of that very first afternoon on the tower landing. She lifted the lid slowly. The lamplight caught the tarnished silver of the locket first, then the soft, faded colors of the little ivory portrait, and I watched Princess Alara lean forward almost involuntarily, the way anyone leans toward an old, well-kept thing that has clearly been loved by somebody once, long ago. Master Finch, standing near the door with his hands folded in front of him, allowed himself a small, private smile at the sight of 2 more people about to fall under the same spell that had already claimed the 3 of us. "May I?" Alara asked, and Maelin nodded so readily that Alara laughed softly before lifting the miniature free of its cloth bed and turning it toward the lamp. She studied the painted face for a long moment, tracing, I think, the same details Maelin and I had traced days before: the tilt of the chin, the faint, private amusement in the eyes, the plain collar that belonged to no court fashion anyone in that room could place. "She has your look, you know," Alara said at last, glancing up at her daughter. "Not your face exactly, your look." The one you get right before you're about to say something nobody in the room is prepared for. Maelin beamed at that with an intensity that made her whole small frame seem to glow, and reached for the ribbon-tied bundle of letters herself, working the knot loose with fingers that had clearly practiced the motion more than once that week, until the ribbon came free, and the 7 letters lay fanned across the table in the order Master Finch had so carefully established. Crown Prince Rowan picked up the first letter, the one that began "My dearest Ispel," and held it a moment without reading, simply looking at the handwriting itself, the loops and slants of a hand 200 years gone. "It's strange," he said quietly, "to hold a piece of paper and understand all at once that the person who wrote it never imagined for a single moment that it would end up here, being read by strangers 5 generations later in a room she never saw, in a palace she probably only visited a handful of times in her whole life." He set it back down with a gentleness I had rarely seen him show toward anything, and looked at his daughter instead. "Read it to us properly, will you? All of them in order, exactly the way you and Corwin and Master Finch first read them. I think that's the right way for this family to hear it for the first time." And she did. I want to tell you that I stood quietly by the door, the way a sergeant of the guard is meant to during a private family moment, and mostly I did, but I will confess that I could not stop myself smiling the whole way through, because Princess Maelin told that story better than I had told it to her father an hour before, better than Master Finch had explained it in the archive, better, I think, than Aloin herself might have managed if she'd been asked to summarize her own life in 10 minutes to an audience of 2 very tired, very surprised parents. Maelin told them about the wobbling drawer and the secret space behind it. She told them about the mud on the riverbank and the prince who couldn't stand on his own 2 feet. She told them, with tremendous relish, about Aloin scolding a future king for being a fool, and about the whole village of Brackenford turning out, weeks later, to watch a crown prince come courting a miller's daughter in front of God and everyone. She untied the ribbon herself, with hands that were only shaking a very little, and read aloud, haltingly, sounding out the old-fashioned handwriting the way she'd once sounded out the names on the guardroom honor board, the very last letter, the one that ended with the line about being prouder of one sentence than of any grand portrait. Crown Prince Rowan sat very still through all of it, in the particular way I had learned, over 4 years of guarding him, meant he was more moved than he wanted to show in front of his daughter. Princess Elara made no such effort to hide it at all. I watched her reach for her husband's hand somewhere around the part about the mill loft and the crying, and not let go of it again for the rest of the evening. When Maelin finished, there was a silence in that study that felt, to me, entirely different from the silence on that empty window seat 5 days before. Not an absence, but a fullness, the particular hush that settles over a room when everyone in it has just understood something true about themselves that they did not know that morning. 5 generations, Rowan said finally, quietly, more to himself than to any of us. 5 generations, and not one of us ever knew. We grew up being told Cordelia came from a noble house in the coastal provinces. I was taught that as a fact, the way you're taught that the sky is blue. She did come from the coastal provinces, Master Finch offered gently, from his place near the door. Just not perhaps from quite the house the record suggests. A mill, Elara said, half laughing, half something closer to tears. Our own ancestor pulled a crown prince out of a flooded river and called him a fool for it, and somebody decided that wasn't a good enough story to put in a book. It's a better story, Maelin said, with the flat, unshakable conviction of a 9-year-old who has decided a thing is true and does not intend to be argued out of it. It's so much better. She was brave, and she didn't even want to be a princess. She just wanted her family to be all right, and everyone forgot her and I found her, and I think that's the best thing I've ever done in my whole entire life. I do not think anyone in that room could have argued with her, and nobody tried. It was Princess Elara in the end, who first raised the question that I had been quietly turning over myself for days without a clear answer. The question of what precisely was supposed to happen now. "What do we do with it?" she asked, looking at the little bundle of letters spread carefully across the low table between them, at the tarnished locket, at the small painted face that had waited 200 years to be recognized. "Do we announce it? Correct the genealogy book. Rennick will have views, I imagine, about how a thing like this ought to be handled." "He does," I said, "and I don't think he's wrong to have them, though I gently suggest his views and Elowen's own wishes might actually agree more than he expects." I nodded toward the letters. She wrote it herself in her own hand in that very last letter. She never asked to be announced or corrected or made a public spectacle of. She asked only that her family be looked after, and that the man she loved never forget where she came from. I don't think she'd have wanted this turned into a formal proclamation, and a press notice 5 days before a state dinner. I think she'd have wanted exactly what's happening in this room right now. Her own family, sitting together, finally knowing the truth of her and loving her a little more for it. Crown Prince Rowan looked at me for a long moment, and then at his daughter, and something in his face settled into a decision. "The sergeant's right," he said. "This isn't a matter for a public notice. This is a private matter, a family matter in the truest sense of that word, and I think the kindest thing we can do for Elowen, 200 years late as it is to treat her memory with exactly the privacy and the dignity she asked for in her own words, rather than turning her into gossip for a dinner table." He turned to Master Finch. "I want the letters preserved properly, archived, protected, catalogued honestly this time, with her own name attached to them rather than the tidy fiction someone gave her. But I don't want them handed to a newspaper or read aloud at the coming dinner as an amusing anecdote for the coastal envoys. This is ours. It stays ours until such time as the family itself decides otherwise." "And the genealogy book?" Elara asked. "Gets a footnote," Rowan said, with the ghost of a smile, "written honestly for once. Princess Cordelia, born Elowen of Brackenford, a miller's daughter who saved a prince from drowning and never once let him forget it." Maelin beamed at that, as though she had personally negotiated the wording. It was Princess Elara who asked, once the practical matters had been settled, and the room had begun to ease into something quieter and more reflective, whether she might read one of the letters herself, and I noticed, watching her, that she chose not the funny one about the fish, nor the triumphant final one, but the letter Elowen had written from the mill loft, the one about lying awake certain the whole business would end in humiliation for her family. Elara read it slowly, her lips moving faintly over certain lines, and when she finished, she sat holding the brittle paper very carefully in both hands for a long moment before she spoke. "I know exactly how she felt," Elara said quietly. "Not the flood, not the prince pulled from a river, but that. Lying awake certain everyone was only waiting for you to prove you didn't belong." She looked up, first at her husband, then at her daughter. "I was not born into this family either, you know. Not the way your father was, not the way Elowen's own husband was. I remember the exact feeling of standing in a room full of people who had grown up knowing which fork to use and how to curtsy before they could properly walk, and wondering whether anyone would ever stop watching me to see if I'd trip over my own hem." "But you didn't trip," Maelin said, with the fierce, uncomplicated loyalty children reserve for their own parents. "You never trip. You're the best at all of it." "I wasn't always the best at all of it," Elara said, laughing a little, brushing a strand of hair back from her daughter's forehead. "I learned, the way I imagine Elowen learned, letter by letter, mistake by mistake, until one day nobody thought to ask any more whether she belonged, because she simply did, so plainly and so completely that the question stopped making sense to ask." She looked back down at the letter in her hands. "I think that is why this matters so much to me, more than I expected it to an hour ago. It isn't only that we have a braver ancestor than the book gave us credit for. It's that somewhere in this family's own true history, buried under 200 years of tidy paint and tidier record-keeping. There was already a woman who knew exactly what it felt like to wonder if she was allowed to be here. I would have liked to have known that on some of my own harder days. I think it would have helped. Crown Prince Rowan reached over and took his wife's hand again at that, and I saw something pass between them that had nothing to do with me, or with Aloan, or even entirely with the letters spread across the table. Something private and long-standing that I had no business trying to name, and did not try to. "When Torin and Bram are a little older," Rowan said after a moment, turning to include his younger children in the plan even though neither of them was in the room to hear it. "I want them to know this too. Not as a secret to be kept from them the way it was kept from all of us for 200 years, but as a story to be given to them properly, the way Maelin gave it to us tonight. I think every child in this family ought to grow up knowing that somewhere back along their own line is a girl who hauled a prince out of a river by his collar and told him off for being a fool, and that the crown found her, and not the other way around." "They'll be so jealous it wasn't them who found the letters," Maelin said, with an entirely unconvincing attempt at sympathy for her younger sibling's future disappointment, and the whole room laughed, which was, I think, exactly the sound that evening had been waiting to arrive at. It fell to me, an hour later, once the family's private conversation had wound its way through wonder and laughter, and at one point, Rowan reading a particularly dry official portrait description aloud in a mocking court recorder's voice that made his wife laugh until she had to wipe her eyes, to actually see the letters safely back into Master Finch's keeping for the night. This was, I understood clearly by then, not a confiscation. Nothing about it carried the cold weight of Master Rennick's earlier fear. Nothing about it resembled evidence being seized. It was, instead, exactly what I had promised Maelin on that first landing 5 days before, a secret being handled carefully so that it would not get spoiled. I knelt down to her level as Master Finch gently gathered the letters, the locket, and the small painted portrait back into their wooden box, and I said, "Your Highness, I need to take this to Master Finch's archive tonight, where it will be kept safe and dry and properly looked after, the way something this old and this precious deserves to be looked after. Is that all right with you?" She looked at the box for a long moment, and I could see her weighing the small pang of parting with it against everything else that had happened that evening, and then she nodded. "You'll keep her safe," she said. It was not entirely a question. "I promise you I will," I said, "and I promise you something else too. This isn't the end of Aloan's story in this family. It's the beginning of it being told properly for the first time in 200 years. You did that. Nobody else in this whole palace did that but you." It was Princess Elara, watching this exchange, who solved the small remaining ache of it before I had even thought to try. She crossed the room, knelt beside her daughter, and unfastened from around her own neck a small, plain gold chain that I had seen her wear for years without ever knowing its significance. From a drawer of her writing desk she produced a locket I had not seen before, new, clearly commissioned rather than inherited, small enough to fit in a child's palm, and inside it, I saw when she opened it to show Maelin, was a tiny painted copy, done that very evening by a startlingly quick-fingered court miniaturist Elara had apparently sent for the moment the story's shape became clear, of Aloan's own face from the old portrait. "The letters belong to the whole family and to history, and they'll be looked after properly in the archive," Elara said, fastening the little chain around her daughter's neck. "But this is yours to keep close, because you're the one who brought her home." Princess Maelin did not say anything at all for a moment, which was, for her, a fairly remarkable event. She simply held the little locket in her fist and looked, for the first time all evening, entirely undone by happiness rather than merely delighted by it. I carried the box down to the archive myself that night, with Master Finch walking beside me discussing, in the contented, unhurried voice of a man whose whole career had just been justified in one evening, exactly how he intended to catalog the letters, how he would write the accompanying note for the family's private records, how he thought the little miniature portrait deserved a proper frame rather than the tin box it had spent 2 centuries in. I said very little in return, mostly because I was still turning over the whole evening in my own mind, trying to understand exactly what it was I had actually done over the past 5 days, and whether I had done it rightly. I decided, by the time we reached the archive room and settled the box into its new home on a shelf, Master Finch had already cleared and labeled that I had. Not because everything had gone smoothly, it had not, and Master Rennick's face when I told him the plan had rearranged itself around him was not an expression I intend to forget, but because the alternative, the version of this story where I had simply done the correct, procedural thing on that very first landing and handed the box straight to the proper authority without a second thought, would have cost Princess Maelin something I do not think could ever have been given back to her. It would have cost her the chance to be the one who found Elowen. It would have made her discovery into an incident, managed and processed and eventually summarized in a memorandum, rather than what it actually became. The truest, brightest thing that had happened to her in a very long time, and I suspect, one of the truest things that had happened to her family in 200 years. The state dinner for the coastal envoys went ahead 5 days later without a single ripple of the disruption Master Rennick had feared, and I noticed, standing my usual post along the receiving line that evening, that he caught my eye once across the hall and gave me the smallest, most reluctant nod of acknowledgement a controller has ever given a sergeant of the guard. I took it, and still take it, as a kind of honor. The genealogy book in Master Finch's archive was quietly, carefully amended within the month, in his own careful hand, exactly as Crown Prince Rowan had asked Princess Cordelia, born Elowen of Brackenford, a miller's daughter who saved a prince from drowning and never once let him forget it. And though it has never been read aloud at any state function, and never printed in any newspaper, it sits there still, true at last, waiting for the next curious child who goes looking. Master Finch tells me, whenever I visit the archive, that he has already had to explain the footnote twice to visiting scholars who noticed the slightly different ink and asked what accounted for it, and that he enjoys the telling of it every single time, though he is careful, as we agreed that first evening in Rowan's study, never to name the letter's exact contents to anyone outside the family without permission. As for the West Tower archive itself, it was in the weeks that followed properly repaired at last, the loose flooring reinforced, the old shelving reset, a proper lock fitted to the door with the brass plaque which now reads simply Archive, West Tower, the entry BY arrangement only having been quietly retired, because Crown Prince Rowan decided, once he'd heard the whole story, that a family archive that could produce something like Elowen's letters ought not to be treated as a place to be kept out of, but a place worth being properly welcomed into. Princess Maelin was given, with both her parents' blessing and Master Finch's evident delight, a standing invitation to visit whenever she liked, so long as she came with either of us at her side, and treated the old papers with the same gentle care she had shown that very first drawer, wobbling it open rather than forcing it. She has taken him up on that invitation more times than I can easily count in the months since. I have spent more afternoons than I ever expected, as a sergeant of the King's Own Guard, sitting, cross-legged on an archive floor, while a 9-year-old princess and an elderly archivist argue happily over whether a smudge in a 200-year-old ledger is a water stain or the ghost of somebody's spilled ink. And I would not trade a single one of those afternoons for the quietest, easiest post in the palace. She still wears the little locket, I should say, on most days that I see her, tucked under her collar more often than not, private rather than paraded, which I think would have suited Elowen very well indeed. The family settled, in the weeks after that first evening, on a small private custom that I did not expect, and that I think Elowen herself would have loved best of anything else that came out of the whole discovery. On the anniversary of the flood, a date Master Finch was able to fix with reasonable confidence from the parish chronicle, once he'd cross-checked it against the letter's own dating. The family gathers quietly, just the household of the private wing, and Master Finch reads the first letter aloud, the one that begins "My dearest Isbel," in the small sitting room off the long gallery, within sight of the grand formal portrait that still, and I suspect always will, get the shape of Eloan's face slightly wrong. Nobody outside that room is invited, and no notice of it has ever been printed anywhere. It is simply a thing the family does now, once a year, the way some families light a candle or set an extra place at the table, and I have been permitted, each time so far, to stand quietly by the door for it, which is an honor I do not think I will ever entirely get used to. Mistress Hollis, retired though she is, has been invited each year as well, and it has become part of the small ceremony that she sings the old nursery rhyme once the letter has been read. The same simple tune about a girl who pulled a stranger from a river and never dreamed a crown, sung now by a woman who spent a lifetime passing it down without knowing what it truly held, to a room full of people who finally do. I have watched Maelin mouth the words along with her, every single year so far, with the quiet, proprietary pride of someone who knows she is the reason the song finally means what it always meant. Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara made a quiet, entirely unofficial visit to Brackenford itself that following spring, traveling without any great procession or announcement, simply as a family wanting to see the place their own history had so unexpectedly grown out of. The mill itself was long gone, replaced generations ago by a newer building on the same stretch of riverbank, but the current miller, an elderly man who had farmed that same bend of water his whole life and had grown up, as it happened, hearing his own grandmother sing a version of the very same rhyme Mistress Hollis still sang at Harrowgate, was overjoyed to walk the family down to the spot where local memory had always placed the old crossing, and to point out with evident pride the exact bend in the river where the story had apparently been told and retold in that village for 2 centuries, without ever once reaching the ears of the people it was actually about. Maelin, I am told, insisted on standing at the water's edge for a long while, saying nothing, simply looking, and when her mother finally asked what she was thinking, she said only that she wanted Eloan to know they'd come. Prince Torin, who turned 12 that winter, took the story rather more seriously than I expected of a boy his age. He asked Master Finch, with great solemnity, whether there might be any other forgotten drawers in the palace worth investigating, and spent the better part of a fortnight informally cataloguing every piece of old furniture in the private wing on his own initiative, much to his tutor's mild despair and his father's very poorly concealed pride. Young Prince Bram, not yet old enough to follow the finer points of succession records and painted portraits, mostly wanted to know whether Eloan had ever gotten to keep the fish the prince eventually learned to catch properly, a question nobody has yet been able to answer from the surviving letters, and which Maelin has taken it upon herself to insist, with complete and cheerful confidence, must certainly have been yes. Master Rennick, for his part, has become, somewhat to both our surprise, something closer to a friend than a source of professional anxiety. He stopped me in a corridor perhaps 2 months after that first evening, cleared his throat in the particular way that meant he had prepared what he was about to say in advance, and told me that he had come to think the whole affair had taught him something about the difference between protecting a family's reputation and protecting a family's peace, and that he suspected he had, for a great many years before that autumn, mistaken the first for the second rather more often than he should have. I told him I thought that was a generous thing to admit, and he told me, rather dryly, not to make a habit of complimenting him either, which I have mostly managed to respect. King Alaric himself was told the whole of it, in due course, though not until some weeks later, once the family had settled comfortably into living with their own fuller history, and no longer needed to guard it quite so carefully even among themselves. Crown Prince Rowan told me afterward with evident amusement that his father's first reaction upon hearing that a miller's daughter had scolded a crown prince of Eldermoor for being a fool by a riverbank was to laugh so hard he had to set down his teacup, and his second reaction was to ask, with rather more seriousness, whether the Order of the Wobbling Drawer accepted honorary members, a request Maelin apparently considered for the better part of a full minute before graciously agreeing, on the condition that he learn the handshake properly, wiggle and all. I am told he did, and that he performs it. On the rare occasions the whole family is gathered together, with considerably more solemnity than the gesture strictly requires, which strikes me as exactly the right note for a king to take with his own granddaughter's secret society. I think about that first afternoon often, the empty window seat, the ajar door, the sound of her voice calling down the spiral stair, "Corwin, come and see." I think about how easily it could have gone differently, how easily an ordinary afternoon's mischief could have become, through nobody's real fault, a cold little lesson about staying where she was told and leaving old things undisturbed. I am glad, more glad than I can properly say, that it became something else instead, that a 9-year-old stubborn curiosity, and one small kindness in choosing to protect that curiosity rather than simply correct it, was enough to bring a brave, funny, entirely real young woman home to a family that had spent 2 centuries not knowing they'd lost her. I have been asked, once or twice since, by other guards newer to the private wing than I am, what exactly my duty was in that whole business, whether I was meant to be protecting the princess, or protecting the family's history, or protecting the crown's dignity, as though it must have been one thing or the other, and I ought to be able to name which. I tell them the truth, which is that it was never really a choice between those things at all. Protecting a child, done rightly, and protecting the truth of a family's own story, done rightly, turned out in the end to be exactly the same task, carried out with exactly the same care. The care of not snatching a wonderful thing out of small hands the moment it is found, but instead kneeling down beside it, looking closely, and asking gently what it might actually be. Eloan of Brackenford waited 200 years to be believed. In the end, it did not take an archivist's expertise, or a controller's caution, or even a crown prince's authority to bring her home. It took one bored, curious, entirely fearless 9-year-old girl, a wobbling drawer, and a guard willing to follow her up the stairs instead of calling her back down them. I have stood a great many posts in my years of service to this family, and guarded a great many doors, but I do not think I have ever done better, more honest work than the evening I carried an old wooden box down a spiral staircase, and let a princess be the one to bring her ancestors' courage back into the light where it always belonged.